trenches right along the Western Front. Men who, until then, had been doing their best to slaughter each other fell under some kind of extraordinary spell. It was as if the angels had come down and gently sprinkled the Christmas spirit on German and British soldiers alike. The firing stopped, a great silence fell, and then slowly a miracle occurred.
It was a Christmas card, Christmas Eve. There was a white, beautiful moonlight, frost on the ground, almost white everywhere. And round about, I think about 7 or 8 in the evening, we heard this singing, a lot of commotion, and we saw some lights. I don't know what they were, some lights. And later, we heard them singing, Still a Silent Night. Still a Night, Silent Night. I shall never forget it. It's one of the highlights of my life, absolutely, to see them. I thought, what a beautiful tune.
Then all of a sudden, lights appeared all along the German trench. And I thought, well, that's a funny thing. Then the Germans started singing, Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. And I woke up, with all the other sentries did the same thing. We all woke up the other people to come along and see this, what on earth's going on. They finished their carol, we applauded them, and then we thought we must retaliate in some way, so we replied with the First Noel.
And it went on for days. Historian Malcolm Brown from the Imperial War Museum is here now, along with Taff Gillingham, who actually spent one Christmas in a trench on the Western Front with a group of mates to gain an insight of what it must have been like for the men who were crouching there 90 years ago and more. Welcome both. Let's talk to you first of all as the historian about this extraordinary episode. This is a documentary going out tonight, which will be going into it in more detail. But it really did happen. This isn't a myth from World War I. It really happened.
Absolutely, it did happen.
Yeah.
Silence fell on Christmas Eve. After all, think of it, there had been a lot of fierce fighting, but it had all settled down. People were in trenches. And once you're in trenches, and only about a couple of 100 yards or even less away, you begin to be interested in what's happening on the other side. And in the German trenches, there were a lot of reservists who had been working in London and had come out there, and they wanted to exercise their English, so they were shouting across one to the other. And there was a joke going around, if on the British side you shouted, waiter, half the Germans would pop up and say, yes, sir, you see. And people would say, there's a regiment opposite, I recognise it. A German shouted out when he saw a Warwickshire regiment opposite, like Taffsy, his is a Warwickshire regiment, saying, I've got a wife and 6 children in Birmingham. And somebody shouts back and says, keep your head down, or there'll be a widow and 6 orphans in Birmingham. So you see, and then you see, the thing was, there was a great conspiracy on both nations' part to send presents to the front. Do you know, there were 2.5 million letters and cards sent to the front, and 400,000 parcels sent to the front on the British side, similarly on the German side. And the Germans also sent Christmas trees. Every unit had a Christmas tree, down to the U-boats as well. So what are they going to do with them? So attack each other with Christmas trees, or put them on the edge of the parapet, put lights on them, and take a
holiday from the war. Lovely. I mean, it was reported in the British media at the time. I mean, we've got this picture from the front page of the Daily Mirror a couple of days after the football game. Look at that. I mean, that's an authentic picture of German and English soldiers at the height of war fraternising. It must have driven the top brass behind the lines mental.
The curious thing, it didn't.
Didn't it?
Some were pretty angry because it wasn't exactly good behaviour. But you see, the thing was, the conditions were so bad. The trenches were so awful that when the truce went on for a day or so, people began to think there's a chance here to do something about it. So, in fact, there was a sort of mutual arrangement whereby you could work on your trenches, the Germans could work on theirs.
And you wouldn't shoot each other.
And they didn't shoot. I interviewed an old boy, now long dead, who said after Christmas they were working on their trenches and their tools weren't very good. They looked across, the Germans are doing rather better, so they said, let's go across and borrow a few tools. So they went across and the Germans said, OK, have some tools.
It's extraordinary, isn't it?
You know, you see the humanity. Also, you see, the common culture of Christmas. You've got 2 nations loving Christmas. The Germans more or less took started off because they always begin their Christmas on Christmas Eve. You see, what they were doing there in the film we just saw, they were
starting Christmas.
Well, look, before we look at some of the wonderful things that Taft's brought, let's have a look at tonight's documentary, which is going out on BBC 2 at 9 o'clock, called The Christmas Truce. And This is actually that they started playing, the British and Germans, they started playing a game of football.
On
and
the
this was
next
happening
day? The next
day, on Christmas Day, and this was happening all the way across the front. Let's have a look.
Everywhere this Christmas afternoon, events are taking on a life of their own. And someone in a Lancashire regiment must have been a clairvoyant, because he's brought the perfect accessory for a day off at the front: a football.
Cheese, man, cheese!
The same scene is repeated in a dozen places, with tin cans, rolled up sandbags, whatever can be found. With teams of 60 aside and less than perfect pitches, scores, like the ball, disappear in the melee. Although one game did produce a familiar result. 3-2 to the Germans.
And just before we do look at this memorabilia here, here's a letter from the Imperial War Museum that they've allowed us to show, sent by a guy called Second Lieutenant Dugan Chater to his mother on Christmas Day 1914, the day that football game happened. He starts by telling her about the game and how amazing it all was, and then he goes on to say this.
We had another parley with the Germans in the middle. We exchanged cigarettes and autographs, and some people took photos. I don't know how long it will go on for. I believe it was supposed to stop yesterday, but we can hear no firing from across the front today, except a little distant shelling. We are, at any rate, having another truce on New Year's Day, as the Germans want to know how the photos came out.
Isn't that? It's heartbreaking,
It's
actually.
heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking because, you know, the carnage apart from those truces was terrible. Show us what you've brought from your... It's not your society. Kind of, you're all amateur historians and writers and keen. But
Yes.
You're not a reenactment society.
No. The Khaki Chums are very unusual. They're actually unique, I would think. They're certainly not a reenactment group. The Chums are a group of authors, collectors, historians, experts in all sort of different aspects of British military history.
Right. Okay.
This captured German helmet,
Yeah.
you got it. I thought that was going to be steel, but is it cardboard?
No, it's leather.
That wouldn't be much good in a firefight, would it?
No, not at all. But there again, neither were soft peak caps either. So
they didn't have tin hats at
No,
first.
Not
Still-
until 1916.
That's right.
No.
That's it.
Right.
Yes, at this stage. And I mean, this was the sort of pinnacle of souvenir hunting. You know,
Absolutely.
That every
Jerry
British
helmet.
soldier was after.
And what would they get? What would they get from? They got presents, didn't
Yes,
they?
yeah.
From the royal family.
Princess Mary, obviously King and Queen's daughter, was very keen as early as October 1914. She'd come up with the idea that every single soldier and sailor should have a Christmas gift. And this whole scheme, with these little brass tins, the smokers all had cigarettes and tobacco. And every single cigarette actually had a monogram on it, with the M on it. There were pipes, there were tinder lighters. The non-smokers had writing sets and sweets. It was a phenomenal...
And postcards to send home with the royal family
With the King
on
and Queen on, yeah. King and Queen sent them as well, and a little 1914 Christmas card as well that came with it.
Fantastic.
A phenomenal
Now,
effort.
If we just run some archive again from the Imperial War Museum, this is what they drifted back into within just a few days. It was all back on again. The whole thing collapsed. Was that because of pressure from behind the lines? Was that because of political pressure, saying, guys, we're in a war here, we're not meant to be shaking hands and having parties?
Well, I mean, my own view of it is that the 1914 truce, the British Army was still predominantly pre-war regular soldiers, professionals.
Yeah.
To them it was business. They would just as happily have gone and fought the French or the Belgians or anybody else.
Yeah.
And as professional soldiers, I think that they were quite capable of saying, actually, I'm going to take a day out of this,
Yeah.
a couple of days off, and then
Interesting
were
answer.
capable of going back and carrying
that's-
on.
I mean, don't forget that 10 departments of France have been invaded and were occupied by the Germans, most of Belgium. So if they did have a nice little arrangement at Christmas, it wasn't a serious business to go on and on.
No.
I mean, many of them dreamed how nice it would be to sort of shake hands and go home, but it just wasn't possible.
Well,
the business had to be finished.
I must do this. This is yours. This is
It is.
Lee Enfield. This is
It
what my
is.
granddad would have had, and many
Yes.
people's granddads would have had. And I remember him telling me the story of when he was in combat, and the Germans were coming in wave after wave, and he and his men were doing this all the time, doing the bolt, checking the magazine, putting it back in. And when the attack was over, they just repelled it. Their hands were, from this bolt, were red, raw,
Yeah.
and blistered because of the heat of the bolt, because
Yeah.
the barrel rifle had got so
Yes.
hot. And that's what my granddad had.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Fantastic. I mean, that really is probably the pinnacle of British arms manufacture for its day.
Yeah.
They've never built anything better before or since.
Well, BBC Two, 9 o'clock tonight. Thank you both very much indeed for coming.
you
And
both very much.
fascinating story. Beautifully told. Thank you.
And somehow heartwarming and uplifting, but somehow terribly
Oh,
sad,
yes,
isn't it?
it is,
Terribly
yeah, it
sad
is.
that it couldn't last completely for the rest of the war, really. But it's always worth now Still staying on Christmas, it's always worth raising your glass during Christmas lunch to toast all those dedicated people who work.